All right, we're on Julien Offray de la Mettrie. He was a horrible person. He looks horrible in the picture, too. He had Jansenist teachers in his youth. He was already bad. And at 15 years of age, he wrote an apology of the Jansenists, the defense of the Jansenists. All right? So that the Jansenists were, well, they called them Catholic Protestants. All the trappings of Catholicism, but Protestant down to the bone. Although his father wished him to be a priest, he preferred to become a physician. He studied in Holland under the tutelage of a Spinozist. Now we'll see Spinoza later. He's a pantheist. He was a thorough materialist. Both his life and death were in accordance with his principles. He teaches that in the world there are only material substances, that the soul of man is merely the sum of the properties of the body, that the end of man consists in sense pleasure, and that enjoyment is the basis of all morality. This is extremely radical. I mean, it makes Epicurus look good. I'm joking, of course. But I mean, this is radical thinking for the 18th century in Catholic France. Man is distinguished from the animals only inasmuch as man possesses articulate language. God bless you. Thought is the result of the organization of matter. The appearance of man in history can be compared to the appearance of mushrooms from time to time, or of flowers which grow alongside ditches or on walls. Yes?
Did Condillac get his idea about language from Mettrie?
Could be the other way around. I think Condillac was... Yeah, I think these ideas were circulating among liberals at the time. You know, there was a lot of what we call unbelief in the 1600s. It already started then. And so there was it's, you know, where does it come from? But it's a good question. But it was there. The whole idea. Locke, he's very close. I mean, the 1700s. Locke is before him. The English empiricists in the 1600s. I mean, this is circulating among liberals of the time. All this idea. For La Mettrie, the orangutan is a being which is practically equal to man. That might be true in certain cases. I can think of some examples. A predecessor of Darwin, he does not see it as impossible that a monkey could achieve the use of language. He says that what we consider to be either virtue or vice is dependent upon material and organic conditions of the individual, such as climate, hunger, food, riches, etc. So it's all relative according to our conditions. All of the faculties of the human soul are purely material, so we're like animals. The soul as well is purely material. La Mettrie, while not outright denying the existence of God, remains indifferent to it. Whether or not he exists has little to do with our happiness. Doesn't matter whether he exists or not. La Mettrie says that human free will is an illusion. Man is a machine, which an absolute fatalism governs imperiously. Remorse is merely a prejudice of upbringing, so you shouldn't regret anything. There is no real distinction between vice and virtue. Mettrie was a physician who was inspired to speak about philosophy because he was struck by the effects of a fever on mind and thought. He published his materialistic theories in 1745 in a work entitled The Natural History of the Soul. The following year, he was banished from France. In 1748, he published Man the Machine, and in that same year, he was banished from Holland. Now, to get banished from Holland in the 18th century, you have to be really, really bad. He fled to Frederick the Great in Prussia, who was really, really bad, where he published Man the Plant in 1748. The court of Frederick II was just a cesspool of everything rotten. Okay? Frederick the Great. Mettrie agreed with Bayle that one could make a nation of atheists, and added that not only is it possible, it is also desirable. Religion for Mettrie is inimical to morality. Mettrie's book on morality is entitled L'art de jouir ou l'école de la volupté, the art of enjoyment or the school of pleasure. Ironically, he died of overeating, choking on the pâté de foie gras. It's true. Upon his death, Frederick the Great wrote the Éloge de Mettrie, a laudatory piece. Frederick the Great knew French very well.
What is pâté de foie gras?
Ah, vous ne savez pas, c'est dommage qu'il n'est pas là, l'abbé. Pâté means paste in French. What they do is, it's a very cruel thing actually, what they do is they force food down they take a goose and make the goose overeat. They force food down its throat. And then they wait a while until the liver swells up trying to process all that food. Then they kill the goose, take the liver, and make a paste out of it. That's why it's called the pâté de foie gras, a fat liver. The paste from a fat liver, that's what it's literally. I can't stand it. I wouldn't even think about eating it. But the French love it. They just love it. But it's extremely cruel. So yeah, he choked on the pâté de foie gras. Poor man. It's funny how God has his ways. Words of Mettrie: if nature has made you a pig, then wallow in the mire, because you are incapable of enjoying a more elevated happiness. Words of wisdom from Mettrie. Yes.
Going back to Jansenism, what exactly is Jansenism?
It's Calvinism under the disguise of Catholicism. All of their ideas about grace, predestination, etc., were Calvinist. And so it was founded by a Bishop Jansenis in Belgium, who lived in the early 1600s, Jansenis. And then he had followers, among them Saint-Cyran. It really got going in France. I just can't remember the name. It really got roots in France, and very typical of Jansenists were a completely stripped chapel, just like the Calvinists do. They detested anything Baroque or anything even mildly decorated. Totally stripped, no statues. It's typical of Calvinists. And they also believed in all of the Calvinist principles of predestination to hell before foreseen demerits, and the very small number of the elect. And and then they discourage people from receiving Holy Communion because you have to be perfect to receive Holy Communion. So maybe once a year you might go to when you really are worked up as perfect. Okay. So very much emphasized the justice of God, and so it discouraged a lot of people, like, who's perfect, So when people get discouraged about their eternal salvation, they start sinning. See, so it was a very insidious heresy, and because of the small number of the elect, the typical Jansenist crucifix has the arms of Christ very tight. See, instead of spread out they're very tight. So he's hanging like this. That's a Jansenist crucifix. It's a symbol of the small number of the elect. I mean, the small number of the elect is nothing. As a matter of fact, the fathers believed in the small number of the elect, but they restricted it so much that only like a few people are going to heaven, everybody else is going to hell. But the fathers said the majority of the human race would be lost to hell, as a general opinion. Very few exceptions. But when you consider the human race over time, and consider the number of people that are living today, that's a very believable thing. What are there, 7 billion people on the planet? How many of those are going to go to heaven? So when you spread that out over time. Yes?
Is there any ancient census of the world, say around the time of Christ, how many people were living?
Yeah, there's estimates. I don't know them offhand, but I mean, it was nowhere near what it is now. Rome was the biggest city, and they estimate that at the height of the empire, 1 million. It was like New York. New York is 8 million people, and 1 million was unheard of in the ancient world. So, Holbach, he was also horrible. Baron Paul von Holbach was born in Germany but resided in Paris. His house was a meeting place for the philosophers. David Hume took part in these gatherings, although he did not like Holbach's dogmatic atheism. He liked D'Alembert better. He was just another one of those creatures. Holbach was the great proponent of atheism. He starts out by presenting the materialism of all ages, beginning with Lucretius and ending with Mettrie. From this he concludes that matter is eternal and necessary in its essence, something we just talked about, de Deo uno, although variable in its forms and in its combinations. He claims that ignorance of nature gave birth to the gods, that the word God is meaningless or merely means the sum of unknown forces which animate the universe. He says that matter is endowed with its own energy and moves by itself. Nature is one reality, and all particular things, including man, are parts of it. So he's a monist. Particular beings, as well as substances, have no objective reality. and are merely products of our imagination. So the food you eat has no objective reality and is merely a product of your imagination. You could tell Dorothy that. Make her job a lot easier. Free will is an illusion because man is subject to necessary laws and fatal influences. The chain of causes and effects is eternal, and they are accomplished with necessity. He says that religion, government, and education lead men irresistibly to evil. In his opinion, religion was the enemy of human happiness and progress. He declares that ignorance and fear created the gods, that fancy, enthusiasm, and deceit have adorned or disfigured the pictures formed of them, that weakness worships them, that credulity preserves them, and that tyranny supports belief in them for its own purposes. Belief in God, so far from making man happy, increases their anxiety and fear. So these people are relatively minor, but they're not what you call serious philosophers, but it does show the progress of this evil thinking and what will eventually become the French Revolution. So then we go to pre-Kantian idealism. And that's Descartes. 1596 to 1650. So René Descartes was born on March 31st, 1596 in Touraine, France. Touraine is the area around Tours. Tours is about, I would say, 200 miles southwest of Paris. In 1604, he was sent to study with the Jesuits at La Flèche, which means the arrow. There he remained until 1612. He had a good opinion of the training which he had received there. He gained there, however, a distaste for traditional philosophy, claiming that nothing was certain in it. So, anytime you have a revolt against scholastic philosophy, you're going to have trouble. There's plenty of things certain in it. Ratzinger felt the same way about. He hated scholastic philosophy. And St. Pius X says that's one of the first signs of a modernist. It's because it's so objective. That's what they don't like about it. He spent a great deal of time in military service, mostly in Germany. This was during the 30 Years' War. He made a pilgrimage to Our Lady of Loreto and to Rome in 1623. He lived in Paris for a while, but finding life there too distracting, he retired to Holland, of course, where he stayed until 1649. During this period of his life, he published his best-known works. In September of 1649, he goes to Sweden in order to instruct Queen Christina in philosophy. But the Swedish winter proved too much for him, and he died in January of 1650. Descartes always considered himself a Catholic, and he died piously in the faith. Nonetheless, there has been a lot of controversy concerning his sincerity as a Catholic. Now, Descartes is important. The general principles of Cartesian philosophy. Descartes proposes to give to the world a new and complete philosophy. So he's going to be the new Aristotle. He has contempt for all the philosophy which had been done up to that time. So you see, his point of departure is completely vain and prideful. That's ridiculous. I'm going to reinvent philosophy. For him, it was full of error. Descartes does not even make the exception of St. Anselm, St. Bonaventure, and St. Thomas Aquinas in this broad claim. So you see, the man is already an idiot. It's true, he's an idiot for saying that. For him, all of their solutions are false and inadmissible. You would have to be a jerk to say that. It's true. To say everything that these people said are false and inadmissible. These huge intellects of the Middle Ages. Having thus leveled to the ground the entire philosophical edifice of Aristotle and St. Thomas, he says that we must redo philosophy by basing it on two principles: universal doubt and free thought. See, so he is the father of modern philosophy. Descartes said, "Let us suppose that there is neither God, nor heaven, nor earth, and that we have no body. Let us doubt everything concerning everything else which has appeared to us to be most certain, even mathematical demonstrations and their principles." He was a mathematician. So 2 + 2 = 4. We have to doubt that. In a word, we must doubt everything except our own thought. Why he makes exception of that, I'll never know. This is the first basis of his philosophy. The second basis is that we should not admit anything as true unless we know its truth with evidence. With regard to truth, human thought must be free of all authority and must submit itself to evidence as the unique rule of truth and certitude. So that's the basis of rationalism. So how do you have faith in anything? Where's the Catholic faith in that? Where's the authority of the Church? We see, therefore, in these two fundamental principles the seeds of rationalism, especially in the context of his rejection of the entire edifice of Aristotelian and Catholic philosophy. This rationalistic principle will imbue all of his philosophical ideas. The philosophical doctrines of Descartes. Descartes begins by setting down his rules for philosophizing, which are very obvious and which he could have easily skipped. He nevertheless presents them in such a way as to make one think that no one had ever thought of them before or had ever used them before. They can be summed up in this manner: to divide the problem into diverse parts and examine each one separately, to review and examine with care the enumeration of the parts, to proceed with order in the research of truths by starting with the most simple objects and rising little by little to the more difficult ones. Really profound. You know, this is a thinker. Doctrine concerning man. The existence of man is self-evident in the consciousness. By the consciousness which one has of one's own thoughts. So that's the cogito ergo sum. See, I think, therefore I am. That's his first principle. And that's important because you can tell that everything is starting from the inside. This could just as easily be, I burp, therefore I am. Because it cries out, and I just did this, in De Deo Uno. It cries out for a higher principle, that if there is an activity, activity demands the subject of activity, that is, something acting. That's what this means. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore there must be a subject thinking. So if I'm burping, there must be a burping subject. So you could do anything. I'm taking out the garbage, therefore I am. Or I'm, urinating, therefore I am. I mean, it's not the first principle. It cries out for a higher principle to make it mean any sense. So you can see he's not a very deep thinker. And he could have studied that in scholastic philosophy if he had paid attention in class. But nonetheless, he has a big influence. Thinking, he says, is not merely to know intellectually, it is also to will, to imagine, to sense. So you're confusing all of those things, which is wrong. The soul is nothing else than a being which thinks. Wrong. It happens to operate the whole body. The essence of the soul consists in thought. So it's subsistent thought. So therefore, if you're not thinking, you must be dead. Which is not true. You know, plenty of people who don't think. Yet they're very much alive. Just as the essence of a body consists in extension, which is not true. Extension is an accident of matter. Since what is extended is essentially divisible and composed of parts, and since thought is essentially divisible and simple, it follows that the body and the soul are two substances which are not only distinct, but also antithetical, opposed, and exclusive of each other. Very important point. See, the opposition between subject and object in the sense of they are against each other. Not that they're distinct and they have a certain relationship of potency and act, which they do, but that they are opposed one to another. See, it's blowing up the bridge. Always remember that about modern philosophy. The body is a substance which is absolutely material and inanimate. The soul is a substance which is absolutely indivisible and animate. Although we may say that man is composed of body and soul, nonetheless, true man is a thinking substance. That is, the soul alone. See, so he divides man. He's a soul, dragging around a body. The body is merely an inert, inanimate instrument of the soul, independent of the soul. The body does not have an influence on the soul through sensation and other organic functions. How do you know things? Nor does the soul have an influence on the body by means of the will, despite all appearances. I mean, this is really sick. So when you will to do something, like to pick up a fork and eat, your soul has no influence on your body? I mean, it's amazing how detached from common sense they can get. So body and soul are two strangers to each other. Nonetheless, Descartes contradicts himself on this point. He says that from the union of body and soul, an unum per se results. Something that is one per se. In other words, that's opposed to per accidens. An unum per accidens is something which is connected by some accident. For example, a house is an unum per accidens. It's composed of many, many different disparate things, but they are all connected by accidental connections. That's an unum per accidens. An unum per se means one thing that is not divided in itself. or in any other way. There's one thing, all right? And so it's an unum per se, even though he has already declared them independent and antithetical. So it doesn't make any sense. He also states, on the one hand, that in order to perceive the union of body and soul, it is necessary to apply the mind very carefully. But on the other hand, he affirms that this union is plain to the senses. But the senses don't tell us anything. I thought we already said that. In one place, he says that body and soul are two complete substances. In another place, he affirms that they are incomplete. In other words, they need each other. So he doesn't know what he's talking about. In his treatise on the passions, Descartes affirms that the soul is united to all the parts of the body and animates all of them, which he denied above. 2, that the soul resides in a special way in the pineal gland. That's part of your brain. 3, that by means of the animal spirits, the soul acts upon the body and vice versa, which is not what he said before. It is clear that Descartes' ideas in his treatise on the passions are significantly different, contradictory to what he has stated in other places about the relationship of body and soul. Descartes also holds to a theory of innate ideas, ideas that you're born with. But here again, serious contradictions appear. On the one hand, he affirms that these innate ideas are very few. Elsewhere, he says that they are innumerable. He says, furthermore, that the knowledge furnished by the senses is only the occasion of exciting the innate ideas. Hence, to sense is to think. But thinking is the foundation of the proof of the immortality and spirituality of the human soul. Therefore, one must refuse to animals the faculty of thinking, lest one give them a spiritual and immortal soul. From this, Descartes concludes that animals are merely machines, the same conclusion as the extreme sensualist Mettrie. Descartes confuses thought not only with sensation, but also with every modification of the soul of which we are conscious. By the word thought, I understand everything which is conscious to life. For example, heartbeat would fall under the notion of thought. I understand everything which is conscious to us inasmuch as they are in our consciousness. This would mean that even movements of the vegetable life, for example, heartbeat, would fall under the notion of thought. Descartes, on the other hand, does not hesitate to make affirmations which betray the excesses of idealism. He says, for example, that the only way in which man can know truth is by the evidence of rational deduction. This is true, he says, because experience is deceiving, whereas deduction is not. If this were true, we would be bound to admit that all of the deductions of all philosophers, no matter how contradictory they may be, because deduction can never be wrong. He also says that bodies are not properly perceived by the senses, but only by the intellect, which is impossible. You open your eyes, you see things. You close your eyes, you don't see things anymore. Doctrine concerning God. For Descartes, the existence of God is demonstrated by the existence of the idea of God in us, which, he says, could not exist in us unless God placed it there, which is not true. He reasons that the cause must be proportionate to the effect, and therefore, since the idea is infinite, its cause must also be infinite. So you have an infinite idea, which is impossible. the human mind cannot bear an infinite idea. Only God is an infinite idea in that sense. He reasons that the cause, we said that. He thus makes the fatal error of passing from the subjective order to the real order. The error is not new. It was made by St. Anselm in the so-called ontological argument in the 12th century. From the fact that the mind perceives that necessary and eternal existence is contained in the idea of the completely perfect being, one must clearly conclude that the supremely perfect being exists. Descartes holds that God created the world by his omnipotence, and that he maintains the world by his free will. But the power and will of God extends not only to the creation and maintenance of the world, but also the essence in such a way that the eternal metaphysical truths and all the relations which exist among them depend on the will of God as the supreme legislator. That means he could the essences of things depend upon the will of God. That's voluntarism. So something could be, he could permit something that is intrinsically evil. In other words, something against the natural law, according to that. Something is against the natural law because of the essence of what is involved. In other words, like generation. There is a certain essence, so that all human generation must be ordered to conception. So if everything just depended on the will of God, he could alter that. See, but he can't alter it because it depends on essence, and essence is a reflection of his own essence. So there's a created essence is the reflection of his own essence. So he can't make something contrary to natural law good without violating his own essence. Descartes says that God was also free to make it so that he would not be so that it would not be true that all lines radiating from the center of a circle would be equal. It all depends on the will of God. It is impossible, intrinsically impossible, that all lines radiating from the center of the circle not be equal. The very definition of a circle, it's part of the definition of a circle. It is essentially to deny that the first principles of reason are founded in the divine essence itself. He could change that. He could say something that exists does not exist, or a cow is not a cow. It's all by the will of God. This makes Descartes a profound skeptic. For Descartes, the knowledge of God is the primitive and unique cause of truth and certitude. This is known as ontologism. See, where we get all of our ideas from God. We have this innate idea of God. It's known as ontologism. In this system, man cannot know anything perfectly without first knowing God. The veracity of God is an innate idea that God is telling the truth. It's an innate idea, along with the innate idea of his existence. It is upon the veracity of God that our certitude of knowledge rests. Descartes is involved in a vicious circle here. For Descartes, we acquire the knowledge of the existence and attributes of God and of his veracity by the evidence which accompanies the innate idea of him. But at the same time, the divine veracity is the necessary foundation, the essential condition that the intellectual or sensitive evidence produce certitude. So what you should do is draw two arrows, one from the top to the bottom, and then one from the bottom to the top. There's your circle. Whereas the intellectual certitude is the condition of the veracity, of divine veracity. But divine veracity is the condition of intellectual certitude. That's a circle. It's famous in Descartes. Cartesian vicious circle. Please distinguish something called a vicious circle from a vicious cycle. Vicious circle is logical. You could have a vicious cycle too, whereas one thing leads to another in morality or something else, but most of the time people confuse those two things. They say a vicious cycle. A vicious circle is a circular reasoning that goes nowhere, where A causes B, but B is the cause of A. That's a vicious circle. So you see that he's got major problems. Descartes' notion of substance. The notion of substance for Descartes pertains, properly speaking, to God alone, because he alone relies on nothing else for existence. His definition of substance, something that relies on nothing else for existence, is going to fuel the pantheism of Spinoza, who will define substance in the same way and conclude that there is but one substance, God, and that therefore everything is God. The Thomistic notion of substance is something that exists on its own and not in something else. So an accident inheres in something else, it inheres in a substance, but a substance can exist on its own. Here, this is something that relies on nothing else for existence. That means an uncaused cause. Well, that means everything is God. And that's exactly what Spinoza will say. This is the man that's going to completely redo philosophy and get it all straight. What a jerk. Descartes' ideas about the world, matter and movement, are the only constitutive principles of the world. Hence, the world is essentially a machine. What will render man more wise is the study of medicine, and that physical truths are the basis of all morality. Descartes' moral teachings. Although Descartes did not write anything which directly treated of moral questions, he does make the following points in his works. That there is a difficulty in reconciling free will with divine providence. The more or less explicit denial of final causality under the pretext that one cannot fathom the infinite wisdom of God. 3, that the eternal truths are mutable, as we have seen above. But the natural conclusion is that the moral order is also mutable. I mean, if mathematical truths are mutable, well, so the moral order is mutable. Descartes is furthermore a determinist, a doctrine explained in a work which was published after his death by his followers. This being so, he would be logically committed to the moral ideas of modern materialists. That means you are subject to, you're like an animal, that you have reactions to things, and you're determined by your exterior, how would you say, stimuli. You have no free will. You see, The cat sees the cat food, it goes and eats it. It's determinism. Critique of Descartes. Descartes' philosophy is neither essentially pantheist, nor essentially skeptic, nor essentially sensualist, nor essentially positivist, but nonetheless contains the seeds of all of these errors. Yes?
What is positivist?
That you only can know things that are facts and which you can deduce. It's a form of rationalism, you know. That's Auguste Comte was the big positivist. We'll see him later. It's a form of rationalism. The exaggerated importance which Descartes gives to thought as a subjective phenomenon, and in general to the data of consciousness, makes the philosophy of Descartes tend to idealism, which is at the same time subjectivist and skeptical. This idealism will be perfected by Kant and Fichte. Descartes merits to be called a rationalist in the truest sense of the term, for he admits of no certitude except what can be deduced from reason. His glaring and multiple contradictions do not speak well of Descartes as a thinker. Descartes resurrects the dualism of Plato, this antithesis between body and soul. We see this in his notion of the independence and opposition of soul and body, the true essence of man consisting only in the soul, and the body being nothing else than a mechanical instrument. That's very much Plato. Cardinal Gonzalez comments, because of the rationalist leaven deposited in its womb, the Cartesian philosophy can be considered as a major premise of an immense syllogism which expresses the general process of anti-Christian and negative philosophy of the past 3 centuries. Descartes says that we can only accept as true that which bears the seal of evidence, and philosophy thereafter will merely develop this principle to the detriment and exclusion of supernatural truths. The 18th century philosophers will provide the minor premise to the gigantic syllogism by saying, but nothing which has been taught to us by theology or scholastic philosophy in Christian morality concerning eternal life and death, etc., bears the mark of evidence. The conclusion will be to admit as certain and true what our senses tell us and what concerns matter. This is the legacy of Descartes. So he's very important in the history of philosophy. All right, stop there too.